Hello? Could you take your seat, please? We're going to start in just a couple of minutes. Okay. Please take your seats. Okay. Welcome to Lunch with the League. I am Joanna Leifer. I'm the Program Committee Chair for the New York City League of Women Voters. Every month, the Program Committee invites an expert speaker to discuss a political or social topic impacting New Yorkers. We've been doing this for several years, or probably 20 years already, and we didn't let COVID stop us. Even though we couldn't meet in person, we Zoomed every month until this September when we opened up once again to live talks. In our September meeting, we had the Manhattan DA, Alvin Bragg, speak to us, and we had an outstanding audience turnout. And last month, in October, we had Bridget Bergen from NYC, who has her own program on elections, and she helped discuss some of the major things that were going to happen in our election, and a lot of them came true. So we're very happy. And today we have a really, really excellent program. We have three panelists who are going to be discussing congestion pricing. But before we get into all of that, I have a few announcements. First of all, we're not going to have a meeting in December. We decided we want to give you all a break so you can all do your shopping and cooking and eating. And we all wish you a happy holiday for December. We'll start again in January 2023. We also want to thank the New York Society for Ethical Culture for the privilege of speaking in this space for our programs. We are honored that, I think so too. We're honored that we can use this majestic building to talk about these very important topics. Next, I want to introduce one of our two co-presidents. We have two presidents to keep us all in line and oversee all our programs. They are terrific. They started in June or July, and they're not too worn out yet. But I'm going to have Kai Rosenthal come up and tell you a little bit more about the League, some of its mission, and some of the upcoming programs.
Thanks, Joanna. Thanks, everyone, for coming out. We know that it's been a busy 10 days with the election. I want to thank Joanna and the rest of the program committee for putting on today's event, and really want to thank everyone for voting, for getting out the vote, for registering voters, for taking friends and family and colleagues to go vote. It was really important to go out there and vote. As you know, that's part of our mission to get everyone here in New York City civically engaged and make sure that their voice is heard. And just, I'm sure that you all know this, but in New York City, the three racial justice ballot proposals that our league supported passed overwhelmingly, and the Environmental Bond Act that the State League supported also passed overwhelmingly. So we're very pleased with both of those. So again, thank you for voting. As you all know, you've probably heard if you've attended the Lunch with the League in the past months, the New York City League has been chosen or was selected as a partner for citywide participatory budgeting here in Manhattan. And Friday is the last day to submit your idea. So if you have some great idea for how the city should spend some of the $5 million, please, 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 you can ask up front for the website to submit your idea. We'd also like to make you aware we are going to be rolling out a Giving Tuesday campaign. So you're going to hear about us with regards to Giving Tuesday, which is the Tuesday right after Thanksgiving. It follows Cyber Monday and Black Friday. So, but please save a few dollars to give to the League. And then just a preview, we have a fundraiser, a gala breakfast in March of 2023, where we will be honoring 3 really dynamic women from organizations in the city who helped in terms of getting out the vote and making sure New York City youth and eligible voters came out to vote. So look for more information in your email and your mail about that. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Joanna to introduce the panel. So thank you.
Thank you, Kai. Before we have our program, I have a lot of thanks I want to acknowledge. First of all, I want to acknowledge Natalie Silverman, who is our program administrator. She keeps me in line. She's always calling me up, telling me what I should have been doing already. And she is one of the main reasons this program comes off so smoothly. I also have to thank Ed Beck, who is right there standing behind the camera. He is incredible. I don't know what we'd do without him taping this, and he also helps with all the PowerPoint information. So we really appreciate that. Additionally, I want to thank my program committee. That includes Adrian Kivelson, Gladys Krasner, Joanne Pugh, Carol Van Duzen, Sheila Hosney, and Judy Wood. Without them, we would not be able to come up with these terrific topics. So now I can introduce our speakers. Today we have a really, I think, vital topic, congestion pricing, and I'm glad so many people showed up. I think this is such a fascinating area, and it's going to be so critical to New York City. We have 3 panelists. Our first is journalist Stephen Nessen, who is the transportation specialist for The Gothamist and speaks often on WNYC. He's written several articles on congestion pricing, and he will give us an overview of the history of congestion pricing and some of the basic details that are involved in it. After he speaks, we're going to have Rachel Weinberger. She's the transportation chair for the Regional Plan Association. This is a think tank devoted to the well-being of our entire metropolitan area, which includes the 5 boroughs, plus 26 contiguous counties in New York and New Jersey. That's quite a lot. She's always busy, I know. She will discuss some of the positives of the program, and there are many. Then the next speaker will be Nicole Gelinas, who is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a contributing editor to their publication, City Journal, a columnist at the New York Post, and she gets published on the left-leaning website Street Blog. And you're on it this just recently, right? Oh, well, that's recent. 3 months is recent. Anyway, she will discuss some of the negatives of congestion pricing, and there are several there too. So we will have each of them speak, and afterwards we'll have a 15-minute Q&A. So without further ado, I'm turning this over to Stephen.
Thank you, Joanna. Thanks, everyone, for having me. It's a real honor and a pleasure. And thank you for the good introductions. I thought maybe, excuse me, before I explain sort of congestion pricing as we've all sort of heard about it, I do a little bit of context setting and a little bit of history, not too far back. Does anyone know who the first person to come up with the idea of congestion pricing is? Mike? Who? No. Yeah?
Was it someone from Singapore?
No. New York's own Columbia University economics professor William Vickery, as far as I've heard. Can anyone guess what year he came up with this concept? 1952. But from the research I've done, he originally, though, he wasn't thinking about cars. He was actually thinking about the subways and sort of a different way to charge people at different times, a higher rate during peak times when it's high traffic and lower rates at others. But obviously in 1952, they didn't really have the technology to do anything like this. Later, in the 70s, he did think about doing it for vehicles, but even still, elected officials thought this was pretty risky stuff. The technology wasn't quite ready, so it never quite happened. Still, the idea that some bridges in New York are free. In Brooklyn, the Williamsburg Bridge, the Brooklyn Bridge, has allowed toll shopping to go on for years. Trucks and cars can choose the free bridge, not the expensive bridges. And the problem with congestion in the city has only gotten worse over the years. Enough of that, let's move up to 2017. I don't know if anyone quite remembers what the subways were like then. I know, the last 2 years have been a crazy blur, 3 years. But in 2017, I do remember the subways were very bad. They were on time, maybe average 65% of the time, I recall. Breakdowns were frequent. I think for me, one of the most vivid things was listening to WNYC every morning, and they would say, there are delays on the A, B, C, D, E, F, and go through all the numbers. And this was, quite frequent and embarrassing and annoying for someone trying to get to work on time. For me, the most vivid memory of that time was an F train that was stuck in a tunnel for 45 minutes without power, and the glass was all steamed up. And when it finally pulled into the station, there were, handprints on the glass like in a horror movie. This was the condition of the subways. And then, obviously, Governor Cuomo stepped in. He had some big plan on how we're going to fix it real quick. He had the Subway Action Plan, which, was a series of small fixes to the subway. But, it wasn't really a sea change. But he started floating the idea of congestion pricing back then, but didn't really have the political support to get it done. Fast forward a little bit, along comes a funny little British man from Toronto named Andy Byford, who came to run the subways. He was quite different. He really talked to riders, he talked to workers to see what the problems were, and he really listened to them, and he started acting on some of the things he was hearing. I won't go into all the details, but, he really listened to people. One of the main concerns he also had was the disabled community, the elderly folks who could not ride the subway if an elevator was broken. Taking Accessoride would strand people for hours in a random borough that they didn't even want to go to when they needed to get to a doctor appointment that happened an hour ago. And he really took that to heart, I think, and listened to the plight of commuters, people who miss meetings, people who miss dinners with their families. And no doubt he was probably talking to the governor about his big plans to how we can make the subways more modern and efficient. So fast forward again to January 2019. For the second time, Governor Cuomo floats the idea of congestion pricing as a way to raise money. And down to like the last weeks of the legislative session, he got all of his muscle together and made the deals that needed to be made and got congestion pricing passed. But what does that exactly mean? Officially, it was called Central Business District Tolling, and it allows the MTA to charge drivers that enter Manhattan below 60th Street, excluding the FDR Drive and the West Side Highway, not including emergency vehicles or vehicles transporting disabled people. Also, anyone who makes less than $60,000 could get some sort of credit. But that was what he got written into law so that this thing called congestion pricing can happen. As for how much the MTA could charge, it would be up to a panel of experts to decide. A panel of 6 people, I believe, one appointed by the mayor, one appointed by the governor, and others representing different regions that the MTA serves. Meanwhile, our friend Andy Byford was refining his plan to modernize the subways. He wanted new signals. Have you ever heard of CBTC? It's the electronic signals like they have on the L train and the 7 train, but pretty much no other line has it. Well, he wanted that on 6 lines, so the trains could move faster, closer together, so you'd have better service. He wanted new elevators in 70 stations, so riders are never no more than 2 stations away from an accessible station. He wanted to buy 1,900 new shiny subway cars, and his idea sort of became the foundation for the MTA's capital plan, which is what they ended up passing. And this is going to be a very expensive project, $51.5 billion at the time. And how is he going to pay for it? The idea was to use money from congestion pricing to pay for a big chunk of that. I believe 30% of that, maybe a little bit more. But obviously, Cuomo didn't like this guy Byford taking too much credit for all of this stuff. So he found some, clever ways to get rid of him. He's gone. And now the MTA is in the position of doing the sort of tedious paperwork to get this thing from a law into action, which is a lot of steps, of course. And then Donald Trump was elected president. And as a punishment, maybe for New Yorkers not voting for him, or the daily protests outside of Trump Tower, or the New York elected officials who he doesn't like, basically he held up congestion pricing during his 4 years. As well as the Gateway project. But fast forward, Biden's elected president, we have a functioning Department of Transportation in DC again, and our very own Transportation Commissioner, Polly Trottenberg, is number 2 at the helm there. And so the process resumes, the feds finally start filling out the paperwork basically to make congestion pricing happen. Fast forward to last September. The paperwork comes back. The MTA has done a big review of the program they want to enact, congestion pricing, and we start to get some details about what it might look like. So I can share some of those with you, and then I'll turn it over to the experts over here. But basically, here's a snapshot of what the MTA found it could do with congestion pricing. If it charged, say, $23 during rush hour, they believe they could reduce car traffic in Manhattan by as much as 20%. If they charge commercial trucks and vehicles $12 to $82, this could decrease truck traffic by up to 81%. So those are just a few of the many, thousands and thousands of things they found. But this is to inform and help people decide, is this something we want? And how do we want it to look? So just a few other bits of background for everyone. In Manhattan, the average vehicle speed is what, do you think? Pretty close, 7 miles per hour. The cost of congestion, according to the MTA, is about 102 hours of lost time a year, about $1,600 per driver. Travel speeds have gone down. It used to be 9.1 miles per hour about a decade ago. So as we said, now it's about 7. Bus speeds are down 28% since 2010, some of the slowest in the country. And as far as how people are using what they call the central business district, only about 24% of the people in here get here by vehicle. 75% take mass transit, the subways. So what does that mean? The goals of congestion pricing are twofold, as you all have certainly heard. One of it is to generate $15 billion for the MTA. 15 billion? It's to generate $1 billion for the MTA. That it can use to fund the improvements that I was talking about. And the other goal, of course, is to reduce traffic. We have climate change. We have a slew of other things happening in the world that are influenced by fossil fuels. So reducing traffic and pollution in Manhattan is another one of the stated goals. There's a whole bunch of scenarios the MTA is looking at. Nothing is set in stone yet. There's 7 different tolling scenarios they're considering. And they haven't decided yet. There's a panel that will start to refine some of the options. A lot of people want exemptions. They're going to have to consider that. For every exemption that they offer, the price could go up, and for other drivers, and the impact of reducing traffic would be less. So that's sort of a broad overview. I'll turn it over to my fine colleagues here. Thank you.
Well, that's a hard act to follow, but I brought some pictures along because that should help. And let's see, I plugged this in a minute ago. If I brought my glasses, that would help me organize my pictures. Okay. All right. Ed, you want to weigh in on this? Is he gone? Oh. There it is, sort of. It's coming in to focus. Okay, wonderful. Can everybody see that? It looks a little bit dim yet. Oh, there you are. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really honored to be here and happy to be on a panel with my colleagues who I know more by reputation than, although I've met them both before, but mostly I get to hear and read what they're thinking about. Oh, sure, I can. I normally speak louder anyway. I sort of got a little quiet because of the mic. I'm just going to talk about the benefits to the region of congestion pricing. I will say that, though, just for the record, Vickery did introduce an idea for congestion pricing for automobiles in 1963, and it was implemented in Singapore in 1975 using paper that people put on their windshields. So the devil is in the details, right? There's lots of ways for congestion pricing to provide benefits, and there's lots of ways for it to be somewhat harmful. And most of my remarks are going to be based on a report that I wrote a couple years back, pre-COVID, when we thought we were really on the eve of congestion pricing being implemented. And as far as the travel behavior and the politics and the thinking, not much has changed except for this blur of pandemic, and so it's still highly relevant. So this is the congestion zone, as Stephen mentioned. It is south of 60th Street, and the peripheral highways are exempted. So if you come through the Battery Tunnel, the Hugh Carey Tunnel nowadays, and just get onto the FDR Drive or the Brooklyn Bridge onto FDR Drive and drive northward, you are not you're not required to pay the congestion fee. It is expressly intended for people who are entering the congested part of the city. So so this legislation was passed at the behest of Cuomo, as Stephen said. It puts the MTA in charge of it. There has to be a memorandum of understanding with the Department of Transportation of New York City, the Traffic Mobility Review Panel, and the revenue target is $1 billion, against which $15 billion should be bonded. So there's that, and it is slated 80% for the subway and 20% to commuter rails, 10% to Metro North, 10% to Long Island Railroad. There are some exemptions written into the legislation. Passenger cars would only be charged once per day. People with a household income of $60,000 or less who live in the zone would get a tax credit. Emergency vehicles are exempted, and vehicles that are carrying persons with disability would also be exempted. So what we know is that congestion pricing works. It works in Singapore. Well, I don't always like to compare the Singapore government and what works there with the New York City government and what works here, because it's a rather different animal. But London and Stockholm provide us both more recent and maybe more analogous examples. When it was implemented in 2003 in London, there was a 15% decrease in traffic, a 20% decline in greenhouse gas emissions. They also added a lot of new buses and bike lanes and express bus lanes and alternatives, so that when people chose not to drive, they had another way that was a better way than driving, perhaps, to come in. It also worked in Stockholm very handily, 22% decrease in traffic congestion. London has since added an emission zone. It's worked in Milan. Milan originally had an emission zone where high-emitting vehicles had to pay to come in, and that was actually so successful in turning over the vehicle fleet that they have now converted that to a congestion zone. So the idea essentially is when people drive into the zone, they are creating delay on other drivers, right? So when you say, oh, I'm stuck in traffic, you're not in traffic, you are traffic, right? And so the idea of congestion pricing is to make you realize the full cost of your journey, which, we were paying with our time, and now the idea is you pay with your money instead. so that some people, and the idea of it not is to knock every vehicle off the road, but to knock 10 to 15% of the vehicles off the road. So there's going to be some number of trips on the margin where that person could easily take transit or drive, and with a little extra push, like an extra amount of money that they'd have to pay to drive, they might just say, you know what, transit's actually better for me. And so if that 10 to 15% of people get on transit, and the other people who decide, you know what, I still like driving, oh, and you know what, I'm also driving faster now, and my trip is more reliable, and right now we're charging nothing, and you're getting a shitty product, pardon my French, and the idea in congestion pricing is we'll charge something, and you'll have a much better journey. So there are some serious equity concerns, but it turns out if you look at the region, people from every county who work in Manhattan far out earn their neighbors, right? Westchester County residents who work in the city earn $71,000 on average more than Westchester County residents who live and work in Westchester County. In Suffolk County, it's $39,000, in Nassau, $40,000, and even people who live in Staten Island and work in Manhattan earn on average $20,000 a year more than their neighbors. So the equity question comes down to, this is a charge that's being applied to the wealthiest people in the region. So some other details on that, only 4% of outer borough residents drive to Manhattan for work. The rest of them either do not work in Manhattan or they use transit. 56% take transit to work and would benefit from better transit service, which would be the outcome of at least the redirection of the revenue from congestion pricing. Only 2% of the working poor would pay the congestion pricing fee, and that is because either they're already not driving, or they do not drive, or their job is not in the congestion zone, and so forth. So the equity questions are raised up frequently, and they're really rather important. Now, Stephen indicated that MTA had modeled, they had analyzed 7 different pricing strategies. None of them is these 4. These are 4 strategies that I analyzed, and the reason that I'm showing them to you is because with the MTA analysis, they were trying to understand a bunch of different possible options, and they're illustrative, and these are illustrative as well. So what my colleagues and I at RPA did was we looked at a scenario where you just charge the same amount all day throughout the day, and then scenarios where you have increasingly peaked charges during the most congested periods. Okay, so the numbers that we came up with were much lower than the MTA's dollar amounts. And I'll just make an extra comment on that. Part of that analysis, the differences in these analyses are due to the different tools that are used for the analysis. And the reality on the ground is we're not going to know. What we know is that if you charge more, you'll get some benefit, and if you charge even more, you'll get even more benefit. We don't actually know where the price points are that people will respond to. And so the numbers that Stephen gave and that have been in the newspaper, $23 to come into the city, are part of just the process that the federal government requires for us to understand what might or might not happen in these different kinds of scenarios. And we have to really get out there and experiment to get what the right actual price is. So what we learned in this, and this is too much for anybody to look at, and so I won't actually ask you to, but if you just look at each one of these scenarios raises about the same $1 billion, okay? So from scenario A, which is the flat fee, to scenario D, which has the highest price in the peak and the lowest prices in the rest of the time, the benefits start to change up. So the more peaked your pricing is, that is, the more you target it exactly to the period of time when the city is most congested, you get the best outcomes in terms of reduced greenhouse gas emissions, in terms of vehicle mile travel saved, in terms of the time travel saved, in terms of the reliability of your trip. So this is the system that we have today. Stephen alluded to something called toll shopping. So what happens here is, well, this is a story I told on the radio. Nicole and I were on, oh my God, how embarrassing. Brian Lair, thank you. How embarrassing to forget Brian Lair's name. And I told the story about how I was driving from Long Island with my mother, who lives in Chelsea. And we were on the Long Island Expressway, and she said to me, "Get off here, we always take the Williamsburg Bridge to save the toll." So my mom was asking me to do something like driving from here, drive down here, go up there, to drive up there. Well, for my mom, she was thinking she was saving $6.55. I apologize, these numbers are slightly out of date. It's not $6.12, it's $6.55 now in Midtown Tunnel. So she was going to save, it was going to take her 10 minutes longer, it was going to add 2 miles of driving, right? If you multiply that across all the New Yorkers who do that, then you get very bad outcomes. So this is one of the reasons why it makes sense to equalize the tolls, so equalize the cost of entry. So it also happens to be the case that, I don't know if you guys are listening in about the BQE and how the part under the promenade is falling down. 25% of the traffic in the AM peak on that piece of the highway are people bypassing the Battery Tunnel in order to take a free bridge into the city. So if you took away, if you made the cost to entry equal, you could make it 0, or you could make it both be at some congestion pricing price, right? If you made it equal, you would take away that money-saving incentive, and you would vastly reduce the emissions, the traffic, and so forth. So, so that is one of the principles that our PA is recommending, and this is a big issue on the getting it right versus getting it wrong. So we are hopeful, and hopefully with your advocacy as well, we can get the Traffic Mobility Review Board to adopt a similar principle that they would equalize the entries rather than just layering on a congestion price on top of the existing tolls and keeping the differential, right? So there's an issue there. I won't dwell here. I want Nicole to have as much time as possible, but this just shows what the cost of crediting different facilities would be in terms of whatever the exemptions are or how else the pricing needs to be scheduled in order just simply to equalize the entry points. So our recommendations for design and implementation in order to get the most benefits that we can from congestion pricing would be to implement the transit and bicycle improvements before you start charging, as London has done, to set traffic, environmental, and health goals and ensure that the benefits are equitably shared, to design a flexible system that can incorporate new technologies and allow for more dynamic pricing. So that way, if you're just driving into the zone and parking, that's one thing. If you're driving into the zone and then just spending the day driving around in the zone, that's a different thing. So at some point, we have the technology. At some point, we have to have the political will or the buy-in to allow that kind of pricing. That's something we might start doing just with taxis or other for-hire vehicles, something where it's not a personal freedom or privacy question. Create a simple method to identify vehicles bypassing the zone, and introduce two-way tolling in the congestion zone for the same reasons as equalizing entry. Now, if you come in at midnight and then you leave at the peak hour of the day, you should be paying in 2 parts. You shouldn't have to pay the same as somebody who came in at the peak hour and left at the peak hour. Recommendations regarding pricing: vary it according to the congestion, and also, as it happens, the times of the most peaked congestion in the city correspond to the times when transit service is most abundant, right? So everybody's coming in at the same time, whether they're driving in or whether they're coming by transit. So if you charge the most when there's the most transit available, then people already have the most alternative options. Set the fee high enough to meet the revenue and congestion targets. Apply a consistent rationale when determining toll credits. One of the big fights is about if the Holland and Lincoln Tunnel are credited, should the George Washington Bridge be as well? And the differentiation there is concerning, particularly to our friends on the New Jersey side of the Hudson. My concern as a transportation planner and not a governor or a politician of any kind is that that would cause people in New Jersey then to drive further south in New Jersey and take the Lincoln Tunnel to save that. And that might not be the most rational trip, right? So we want all the points of entry to be equalized. Right now, taxis and other for-hire vehicles are already paying congestion surcharge. We think that should be kept and that they needn't be charged another time. It doesn't make sense for their business model, and also to limit the exemptions to those already specified in the legislature. So in closing, I'll just say This program provides us an opportunity to solve Manhattan's very complex and inequitable toll shopping system. The revenue generated goes to transit. It helps everybody. Even again, I'll talk about the New Jersey folks. 75% of New Jersey commuters come in by transit, and they get onto the New York City subway system as well. Not all of them, but a large portion of them. So there are benefits to New Jersey that aren't being realized. Anyway, the revenue generated will be an important piece of our funding going forward, and we really need to get it right in order to reap the most benefits. So I'll close there. Thank you.
Hi everyone. I want to thank Joanna and Carol and the League and the ethical culture people for having us today as well. I will get my computer hooked up here if all goes well. Perfect. So I don't agree with anything that Stephen or Rachel said. I don't. In that that I actually agree with everything they said in theory, but we are no longer in theory. We are in practice. So as both Stephen and Rachel said, which I completely agree with. We've been talking about congestion pricing since 1952. Congestion pricing has been a political idea in New York City since the John Lindsay administration. In the late 1960s, Lindy and then Governor Rockefeller proposed a plan to toll the free bridges across the East River, crude form of congestion pricing. This was ultimately killed by Congress. The Brooklyn and Queens delegation of Congress passed a federal law outlawing that version of congestion pricing in New York City. So we've had more than half a century of congestion pricing being a politically active idea in New York City and New York State. As Stephen said, we passed the congestion pricing law 3.5 years ago. Trump has been gone for close to 2 years, so we've had 2 years of the Biden administration to get the details of this rate, of this right. The New York governor, Governor Hochul, who controls the MTA, certainly understands it is important for the MTA to get these details right. And the MTA came out with their environmental assessment of the congestion pricing plan in practice in August. So now for 3 months, we've had an actual plan, not what we want to do, not what we should do, not what we could do, not what other cities around the world do, but what we are actually going to do, one of these 7 scenarios. All of these slides, except for 2, come from the MTA's environmental assessment. I did a very lazy slideshow. I just cut and paste straight from the environmental assessments and just put a little yellow coloring in there. And I did that because I want you to see what is the MTA saying about its own congestion pricing plan. What does the MTA's congestion pricing plan have to say about itself? So, first of all, as both of my fellow speakers ably noted, there are 2 goals of congestion pricing: reduce congestion and raise revenue. These goals are supposed to be equal, as the state legislature laid out. But are the actual plans that the MTA put out in August, are these plans done with the eye of reducing congestion or raising revenue first? Well, there are some clues in the 7 scenarios that the MTA put out. I don't think that's too small for you to see, but in terms of, if not, you'll have to take my word for it, but in terms of is the goal to reduce congestion during the highest hours of congestion, the morning and the evening peak hours? If that were true, the peak hours would be the rush hours, maybe 4 to 6 hours if you count both rush hours. So instead of charging the highest price just at the peak hours, 6 out of these 7 proposals that the MTA put out would charge a peak hour price for 14 hours out of the day. 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. is the peak hour. This is not, this sort of like insults the English language. And what does the word peak mean? Peak means not 14 hours, not the majority of the 24-hour day. So with a peak hour of 14 hours a day, that means there isn't a lot of incentive to say, come in if you're driving into a matinee an hour before everyone else is driving in for the matinee, or leave work an hour later after the rush hours are over if you are driving into work, or if you are driving a truck to do your deliveries on the off-peak hours of those 14 hours. For 14 hours a day, very blunt peak hour toll. This is raising revenue. This is not having a fine-tuned tool to reduce peak hour congestion. Okay, now if you look at the very bottom there, overnight, if the point of congestion pricing, or one of the points of congestion pricing, is to encourage people to use mass transit because there is mass transit available, none of these 7 plans that the MTA put out would have a free trip into the congestion pricing zone overnight. You would be paying between $5 and $12 even in the overnight hours to enter core Midtown, Lower Manhattan, Chelsea, Greenwich Village, everything inside in between Midtown and Lower Manhattan. So if I'm coming home from a party, or if I have an emergency and I have to visit someone in a hospital in Manhattan, or whatever reason I'm driving into Manhattan at 2 a.m., does this pass the test? Is there mass transit? Not really. There's no Metro North service into Manhattan in the overnight hours. There is very limited Long Island Railroad service. You know, good luck trying to take the LIRR into Manhattan in the overnight hours. And very limited and not really optimal subway service in the overnight hours. But still, if I want to drive in at these times, I have to pay a fee, even though there is no congestion in the overnight hours. You know, traffic on 8th Avenue, traffic on 5th Avenue, traffic across town flows quite smoothly. So the overnight charge, there's no congestion justification for charging overnight, and there is not really great mass transit to take. This is, you know, for years, we've heard congestion pricing is not a tax because you have choices. If you are coming in overnight, it is a tax because there are not really good choices. And this is not how it works in London. London does not charge overnight fees. They do charge a blunt peak hour fee, but they don't charge at all outside of the peak hours. So this comes right from TfL in London, where Andy Byford came from, 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. Monday through Friday. These are the only times that you pay the congestion pricing fee, about $23. Actually, less than $23 because the pound is way down, so closer to $15. So there's no evening fee, there's no overnight fee. Saturdays and Sundays, it's 12 to 6. They have bluntly said, okay, we don't want to fool around with peak hours, but these are sort of the peak hours, and these are the only times we charge the fee. Much more driven toward reducing congestion than raising money. And it doesn't raise anywhere close to $1 billion. It raises about $400 billion annually. Okay, so for years, actually decades, we have heard congestion pricing is not just to benefit the rich people in Manhattan, it's to benefit everybody. The whole city will benefit from congestion pricing. How is that? Because the driving into Manhattan will be reduced to such an extent that every neighborhood will benefit. So if you're worried about asthma rates in the Bronx, one of the highest heat maps for asthma in the nation, actually maybe the highest heat map for asthma in the nation, The congestion pricing will alleviate asthma in the Bronx because fewer people will be driving through the Bronx to get to core Manhattan. Okay, kind of made sense. But here we are, the 7 plans. Again, this comes straight from the MTA. This is not me saying this. This is them saying this. In all but one of the 7 scenarios, congestion pricing, as the MTA has devised it, would raise the number of trucks crossing the Cross Bronx Expressway every day. So you would increase the number of trucks between 50 trucks a day, more than the current close to 30,000, or 704 extra trucks a day, more in addition to the current 30,000. In this impact on the Cross Bronx means that overall in the Bronx, the number of vehicle miles traveled through the Bronx every day goes up, doesn't go down. So you have about 7.5 million vehicle miles traveled every day in the Bronx. That would go up in 5 of these 7 scenarios between 5,000 or 2,000 miles every day or 22,000, depending on which of these scenarios they pick. In only 2 scenarios would car and truck traffic across the Bronx decline. Again, these are the plans that the MTA put out. And this was kind of minimized by the congestion pricing advocates until the Bronx congressperson Richie Torres came out, said the MTA never told him about this. Hundreds more trucks a day on the Cross Bronx is just not acceptable at all, which is true. So this is our first issue, that again, these are the real plans. There's no like, we're gonna fix this later, we'll deal with it in some other plan. This is later. If we are going to address the fact that congestion pricing adds truck traffic to the Bronx, this is when we do it, not 5 years from now or 10 years from now. You know, the history of New York City has been dump all of our traffic problems into the Bronx. This is just another element of that, at least in the way that the MTA has drawn this out. I know no one cares about Staten Island, not very fashionable to care about Staten Island, but a word for our car-dependent people on Staten Island. Again, for years, we were told congestion pricing will help Staten Island, and by the way, if it doesn't, we will at least give them a toll credit on the Verrazano-Narrows Bridge. The Sam Schwartz congestion pricing plan came out about a decade ago. Sam Schwartz, a former city traffic commissioner, said, I understand there's no great transit to come from Staten Island to Midtown Manhattan. If you want to take transit, if you don't live right near the ferry, you've got to take a bus to the ferry and then take another subway. It takes a long time. Since there's no terrific competing transit to get out of your car, we will give you a partial credit on the Verrazano-Narrows Bridge. The MTA 7 plans, that credit is gone. No explanation why they're not doing a partial credit on the Verrazano Bridge, except for obviously that they need the money. In every single scenario here, congestion pricing would raise vehicle miles traveled in Staten Island. So you get roughly 4 million a day vehicle miles traveled. Every single scenario goes up by close to 100,000 vehicle miles traveled every day. This is because in both the Bronx and Staten Island, congestion pricing doesn't reduce traffic overall citywide, it only diverts traffic. It diverts particularly truck traffic away from Manhattan onto the Bronx, and does the same in diverting more traffic onto Staten Island's sort of belts highways. So 2 boroughs going to see more traffic, not less. These are not wild guesses from congestion pricing opponents. This is what the MTA's highly paid traffic experts have come up with, and they have supposedly done a full gamut of scenarios. If there's some secret scenario out there where traffic in the Bronx and Staten Island falls, they didn't model that scenario. And the advocates say the scenarios the MTA did are all wrong. If they're wrong, they should fix them, but that's what they put out. Okay, so again, we've had 3.5 years where congestion pricing has been state law. Although Trump delayed the process going through the federal environmental review for the first year where congestion pricing was law, April 2019 through the end of 2020, so a year and a half, that delay didn't stop the MTA from asking or answering very basic questions. Nothing to do with Trump, why the MTA has not answered these questions. Trump has again been gone for more than a year and a half. MTA still has not answered these questions. Okay, so what are the things that we still don't know, despite the fact that this law was passed 3.5 years ago? Will there be an exemption for public employees, that is city and state workers, commuting in their own private cars? This is very important because if you look at all the different things that MTA said, these are things we could do to reduce congestion. The only idea that actually reduces congestion as much as congestion pricing does without raising any money is reducing the number of government-issued parking permits to people who are driving their own cars to work. So if we just reduce the more than 100,000 permits that city workers have to drive to work and park, you entirely get the benefit of congestion pricing in terms of reducing congestion. You just don't get the money. This meets both of the non-financial objectives. So that's very important because it also works the other way around. If we get a last-minute exemption for public employees, you substantially reduce the congestion benefit of congestion pricing. It then just becomes a tax on private sector workers who don't work for the government. And you can see this, Lower Manhattan, streets are just clogged up with people either driving to work or parking because they have a government placard. So this is something we still don't know the answer to. Why don't we know the answer? Because the MTA doesn't want to answer it because it is very politically sensitive. If you are brave enough to foist congestion pricing on everyone, you are brave enough to answer this question well enough before now. Same thing with taxis. Very, very important how congestion pricing treats yellow taxis, green taxis, Ubers, Lyfts, all the other for-hire vehicles. So you would think we would have some semblance of an answer. What kind of fee will the taxis and the Ubers pay? Instead, we have 7 entirely different answers ranging from yellow cabs will be exempt, to the for-hire vehicles will pay every time they enter the zone, to they can pay a couple times and then it will be capped. This is very important to get right. We need an answer to how the cabs and the Ubers are treated. Why is this important? One, because of congestion. If you only charge Ubers, Lyfts, and/or yellow taxis to come into the zone once a day, they then have a huge incentive to stay in the zone all day because they don't have to pay again. So you could see Manhattan easily get clogged up with Ubers and yellow cabs that just sort of ferry people from Greenwich Village to Midtown Manhattan to their jobs or wherever, and just be entirely exempt from the congestion fee after they've paid that fee once. On the other hand, you could have someone wanting to go out to eat in Midtown with friends, want to do a little drinking, take a taxi home at 10 o'clock at night. Will there be an extra $23 charge on top of that taxi fee to go out of the zone? Would be kind of ridiculous, entirely eliminates the incentive to take mass transit into core Manhattan and then take a cab out. Either way, we should have an answer. Nothing at all stopping the MTA from answering this question, but we still have no clue at all. Okay, so what does all this mean with the caveats that we still don't know extremely important things that are kind of make or break for congestion pricing? After the tolls are put in place, the first year of the tolls, supposed to be 2023, we'll see citywide, the traffic reduction you see is really not impressive. The most citywide traffic reduction you see is about 1.5%. The least traffic is basically flat, down a little bit more than 0.5%. Again, that is because, for the most part, congestion pricing diverts traffic. It doesn't reduce traffic. That's particularly true with trucks. So the citywide results for something that we have been told for 2 generations is the holy grail of reducing traffic, not just in Midtown, but in the whole city, is really not all that impressive. When you go out to the long-term picture, 2025, also not very impressive. Basically, traffic citywide is flat. Now, you can see, who cares what's going to happen in 2045? We have no idea. We could have flying cars. We could have no cars at all. These are just nonsense projections. That's true. I mean, we should certainly know what's going to happen in 2023. 2025 is closer to a guess. But we actually have a model city that did this 20 years ago, basically as far away as 2045 is from now. 2003 is also far away, 20 years in the past, 2045, 20 years in the future. So how is London's congestion pricing program working 20 years along? Again, program started in 2003. Next spring, it'll be 20 years old. Yes, it reduced traffic significantly in the first couple of years of the program, but because they didn't treat the Ubers right in particular, and because just like us, they have more Amazon deliveries, they have more for-hire vehicles just circulating in the zone once they've paid to go into the zone. On the eve of the pandemic, February 2020, Guardian did a huge report. London got rid of private cars and grew more congested than ever. Traffic, basically, by February 2020, was right back to where it had been before they put in congestion pricing. As the Guardian asked in this article, why is traffic moving more slowly than ever? More delivery vans and more Ubers. Doesn't mean that congestion pricing can't work, but you have to get the details right. And on the eve of implementing this, the MTA is still punting on these basic details. Same thing, Bloomberg News did a report earlier this year. Yes, congestion pricing succeeded at first, but 18 years on, many are arguing that the charge in its current form is obsolete, which it is. A cord and toll to enter once and then drive around as much as you want once you're in the zone doesn't really work very well in the Uber and Lyft age. So, I'll just conclude by saying, again, congestion pricing is a terrific idea in theory. I agree with everything that my colleague said in theory, but here we are no longer in theory. These are the plans that are on the table, and in the way that the MTA and indirectly Governor Hochul have laid this out, very, very difficult to support this actual plan. Now, can't we be flexible and change the plan later if it's not working very well? The answer to that is not really. MTA is a bureaucratic entity, very afraid of change, very afraid of angering the governor who appoints the appointees, not very flexible in experimenting or changing things once they are in place. So these are the plans that we are going to get if we indeed do get it, and this is the time to ask ourselves, is this the plan that we've been waiting for 70 years? Thank you.
Well, thank you all. I'm overwhelmed. This was great. I'm sure there are a lot of questions that people would like to ask. I think you all have little mics next to you. I don't know how they work. I hope you do. And we have a series of questions. Carol, would you walk around?
Hello. From 2010 to 2019. Yeah, I mean, you're totally right. And I know, I don't remember exactly what year it was, but the city put a cap on the number of new Ubers and Lyfts that can go on the market, you know, in an effort to stop the tamp down the explosive growth that, you know, as you saw, as we all saw, went unchecked, you know, for the first few years, and really, you know, clogged up our streets, and we're still living with it.
Also, Taxi and Limousine Commission has. So the Taxi and Limousine Commission. You want to give me the mic from the, or I can come up there. I can just do this. So Taxi and Limousine Commission also has put in a rule that the vehicles have to have a passenger in them a certain percentage of the time. And also the Lyft and Uber are amenable to having an increased surcharge on congestion. So, and I think the point that, that Nicole makes, that if we dealt with this issue, we resolve the entire traffic issue, I think is a little, it's a reach maybe a little bit too far. For one thing, we have actually had insane traffic in Manhattan, certainly in everybody's memory. The fact that this is another component is just another, it's on the margin. So it's a new component that's crashed the entire system, right? So traffic is a linear problem. Traffic is like here, and then it's a cliff, right? Which is why congestion pricing works when you just reduce the traffic by 10 to 15%, right? So you get a small reduction at the margin, at the very worst time, gives you a very big benefit. So if you just take a few vehicles off, you just get a huge bang for it. And so yes, it's an important issue. It needs to be part of any planning exercise, but I would also caution us all not to load every problem of mobility in New York City onto this one program.
Is there anything we can do? Like we talk about the time is now. What's the are the plans like where are we in terms of hearing?
Yeah, that's wrong. Yeah, they're out of our hands for the moment in that is this working? Yes. Oh, okay. In that the MTA just finished a public comment process under the environmental review. So if you wanted to, up until late September, you could go on Zoom, give the MTA a public comment. I'm sure they take all the comments very seriously, but for the moment, it's sort of stuck back in federal bureaucracy, and that the federal government is now deciding, does this have a significant environmental impact or not? If they decide that it doesn't have a negative environmental impact, then the MTA will start to go ahead and pick some iteration of these 7 plans. And also, finally, the MTA has named this 6-person committee to advise on things like taxis, public employee exemptions, all of those things. Interestingly, none of the 6 committee members lives within the congestion zone. So there is a Long Island person, there's a Westchester person, there's a person who lives on Roosevelt Island, which is not in the congestion zone, but there is no committee representation on what do people like many of ourselves want to see from this in living in the zone.
So that's true, and Nicole made a very compelling presentation, and I appreciated hearing that. But I also want to say she mentioned that MTA has not come forward with any of the details about what they're doing about taxis, and their plans are all over the place, which to me suggests they don't have an actual plan yet. And the legislation, the way it's written, is the traffic review, the mobility review board, is tasked with coming up with a plan. And I don't want to get too much into the weeds with arcane details, but the environmental assessment that Nicole presented and skewered so effectively was a requirement of the federal government, and the MTA was told to use a particular model that's not well suited necessarily. Now, for my money, the number of trucks that are expected to be diverted from the zone into the Bronx depends on there being a huge number of trucks already in Manhattan that are not bound for Manhattan, right? So they're suggesting that there is an 8,000 a day base of trucks that are going from New Jersey to Long Island and cutting across Manhattan. I don't think they're coming in the Holland Tunnel. I don't think they're coming in the Lincoln Tunnel. And if they're coming over the George Washington Bridge, they are not dropping down into the zone in order to drive out through the Midtown Tunnel. So this is, again, it's sort of an arcane, weedy notion about how traffic analysis is done. And so the diversions of those trucks is predicated on those trucks existing in the first place. Now, I have also polled several truck drivers that I know. My brother's a truck driver. I like to start at home. And I said to him, if you were going from Hoboken to Jamaica, Queens, would you come through Manhattan? Not on your life. So there are some serious questions about the details of the technical analysis. And again, not a single one of them is a plan. They are scenarios to be tested to understand the environmental impacts, and that's part of the legally required environmental review to comport with the NEPA requirements. So then the federal government says, okay, the environmental impacts need to be mitigated, or they don't, and then go ahead and devise the program. Now, even these model results do not show the improvements that would be made using the congestion pricing revenue to the transit system. So they've not modeled really what the whole impact is. And also MTA has suggested a roster of mitigations to help the Bronx air quality, and none of that is considered in the environmental review because there's not a place for it in the federal process.
I have no comment on that. Just to follow up on sort of what I think what you were asking, not exactly that I think, but like what can you do to get involved in this process? Like the kind of advocacy. And there's, as far as I've seen, there's not like a ton of pro congestion pricing groups other than like some of the transit advocate groups. I mean, there's RPA, but Riders Alliance, Transportation Alternatives are sort of like the advocacy, avenues for, being pro congestion pricing. New Jersey is pretty outspoken, like a lot of their Congress folks, Governor Murphy himself is pretty critical of it. So they're sort of rallying against it. But in New York City anyways, I think, like Transportation Alternatives, Riders Alliance have been sort of pushing Governor Hochul and the MTA to, do something, very proactive and something, high rate of ticketing for congestion pricing.
Get in touch with me. I will hook you up with some advocates.
We'll make sure that everybody has that. Now, we're doing this the old-fashioned way. I have to run over to somebody and have to bring the mic back.
Thank you. I'm a Queens resident, and I'm in Flushing, so I appreciate the number 7 line, and they improved it dramatically, but they didn't lengthen it. And what they've done is the development in Flushing and Queens is extraordinary, so you can barely get on a train. And I can walk to the train, but the people who live in Queens 5 miles east of where I am have no alternatives. And I haven't seen anybody try to improve that. They closed the parking lot at City Field, so they don't even allow people to come in and park. There's been no effort in Queens to make any plan for congestion pricing. We're interested, we go to meetings, but nobody has presented anything. Is there a way? All of Queens has 5 miles between the end of the borough and any reliable subway. And so what are we going to do to improve that? I want to thank you. I think you should go on the road. I've been going to these meetings for 25 years, and that was the best presentation I've ever heard. So thank you.
I think you should absolutely get in touch with the borough president's office and raise your concern there. That is a political entry point where that concern will be considered. So the current devotion of the funds is not toward expanding the system, it's toward repairing the system. And we do need to look more seriously. I mean, certainly in my memory, we switched to a free transfer where it used to be a double fare zone, right? So we need to think about other ways of getting people to access points to the subway, or make the bus system better, and our select bus service is one way to do that. But we definitely need to reconsider transportation and mobility all the time, especially as new innovations come in, and agree 100% with Nicole. The parking permit thing is a fiasco and a disaster, and that's on the city's watch, not on the state's. So.
Yeah, I think that's one of the fundamental problems of so many competing jurisdictions, that even if the MTA doesn't allow for an exemption for public employees, we have more and more people covering up their license plate covers. Who is going to enforce against that? Because you'll be charged based on a reading of your license plate. So if you have public employees covering up their license plates with a sort of glary screen to avoid the congestion toll, who is going to enforce the law against that? You know, and that's not like some sort of crazy idea. I mean, this is going to happen. You have illegal parking all over New York City by public employees, something that is just not enforced against. This is something the city should have dealt with ages ago. But as for Queens, yes, the original versions of congestion pricing, Bloomberg, Sam Schwartz, said they went to the elected officials in Eastern Queens. Sam Schwartz is much better at that than Bloomberg was, and said, okay, we know you don't have very much transit. What do you want to get on board with this plan? And didn't get everybody on board, but did get some support in saying, we'll use some of this money for better bus service through Queens, lowering the price of the Long Island Railroad ticket within the city, and so forth. Some of that has been done, but the MTA's financial woes are just so significant right now that it's a bit of a fantasy to think that we're going to get any better transit service with congestion pricing. This is supposed to go to the capital budget to make infrastructure investments in physical assets. The capital budget over 5 years is $54 billion. This pays for $15 billion of that. But we are using 30 years worth of congestion pricing revenue to pay for one 5-year capital plan. Another 5 years, we'll be back here looking for another source of tax revenue for the MTA. In addition to their capital needs, they have a $2.5 billion annual operating budget deficit against their $20 billion annual budget deficit, as soon as the federal COVID funds run out. So now is the time for them to be really addressing how they can reform some of their costs. They're not doing any of that. We're going to have the labor agreement up next summer. The workers naturally want to raise to keep up with inflation. If this is not done right, the legislature will simply allow the congestion pricing revenue to go toward the operating budget. You see no improvements in the capital budget at all, and still have significant operating budget deficits. So the idea that, like in London, you get congestion pricing and you get this amazing transit system, that is not what is going to happen in this case. Is it better than nothing? Arguably, but it is. This is not the situation of London 20 years ago.
I don't have anything to add other than there is a Queens bus route redesign that should go into effect, is going into effect. The first time they've redrawn the bus routes in, like, was it 100 years or something? So that's cool.
I'm going to run down. There was a couple of people in the back that had their hands up.
I'm sorry, but I didn't hear what you had to say about people who are disabled. I came here and planned and was a half hour late or more by Accessoride from Chelsea to here. Nobody has said what would happen to me in this scenario.
We did say that. There's an exemption in the law. So that answers the accessoride question. Accessoride is transit.
Yeah. Hello. Okay. No, yeah. The program would not toll accessorized vehicles, and I guess part of the idea is with less traffic on the road, vehicles that have to be there, like accessorized vehicles, would get where they need to go faster. That's the idea. But you know, we'll see what 10% reduction in traffic looks like on the ground.
Also, while we deride Lyft and Uber, we might adopt their technology for accessoride so that we can get a much better service. If I were the king of the world.
Okay. I'm concerned about truck traffic into Manhattan because it's bringing in stuff we need. And so that's a major concern. You know, how do you get your vegetables and everything else delivered if they have to pay $23 a shot coming into Manhattan?
Yeah, if this is working now, yeah, I think that's a legitimate concern that the 7 scenarios the MTA put out, which should encompass all possible scenarios. I mean, this is the entire reason they did it. So again, if there's some secret plan out there that solves all these problems, they did not put it into this multi-thousand-page environmental review and appendices. But the idea of trucks coming in overnight, people live in Manhattan. They don't want to hear the loading and unloading noise overnight. The loading staff is not working in many cases during the overnight hours. So this idea that they will avoid the peak toll by coming in at different hours, still a very, very crude sense of development.
So, first of all, I appreciate the way you phrase that. Most of the time I hear people complaining about the truck traffic, and they forget that the truck traffic is there because of us, not in spite of us. There's a huge surge in truck traffic, as we see in the London example, and as we see here, because of the huge surge in e-commerce. And we think that the pandemic has accelerated the e-commerce trend by a number of years, maybe as much as 30 or 40, according to how the projections go. Now, some of the e-commerce delivery is also slowing down, right? Amazon is no longer immediately next day. Also, you know, they do this thing where they have a delivery day for you. Now, I had the experience recently of ordering 3 things from Amazon, and I said, yes, bring them all on the same day. And what I got was 3 different trucks came to my door on Wednesday, right? So they need definitely to get better at organizing that so that there's less impact from that, so that we have more degrees of freedom, if you will, for the other kinds of deliveries. And agree with Nicole that if you have this across-the-board fee, you're not in service of operating the city in a more efficient kind of a way, and there should be cheaper times for truck deliveries. So all of these are details that need to get worked out. There is no plan yet, and maybe there should be. Maybe we should be discussing the actual plan that's going to actually occur, and we're not yet. But these are all very important concerns, and I encourage all of you, especially as it is the League of Women Voters, to talk to your congressional representatives, talk to your city council members, talk to your borough presidents, because it is a political process and your voices do matter.
And just one thing, the city, you know, they're not just doing literally nothing, but almost nothing. But they do have some pilots underway that they're trying to find other ways to get goods into the
the things that talking about trucks, what about garbage trucks? What about garbage pickup? Are we making it hard for our garbage to be picked up besides the sanitation department, which I'm assuming they're not going to charge, but what about the private garbage services that pick up from, business establishments? Are they going to, this has always been an area of iffiness anyway.
It is indeed an area of iffiness. Usually that pickup is overnight. So in the best case scenario, there won't be an overnight charge. In the worst case scenario, there'll be a more minimal overnight charge. And the city has actually tried to improve that. A few years ago, they passed legislation where they now are doing area franchises for commercial pickup rather than having every commercial garbage collector picking up all on the same block. So you'll only get one truck instead of 20 on any commercial block. So definitely another issue that's important and being worked on.
My turn. Assemblymember David Weprin of Queens is planning of introducing legislation to introduce legislation that would delay the plan. Besides getting more votes in Queens, do you think it has any possibility?
So Gladys wanted to know if there's any possibility of Assemblyman David Weprin's of Queens plan to introduce legislation to delay congestion pricing. Is that a possibility? Yes, I think there are several ways in which lawmakers could delay the plan. One, through state legislation. The governor won by obviously a very, very close margin in a race that was supposed to be easy. Lawmakers know that they are up for re-election in another 2 years. Will they be concerned that some voters will punish them over this? Probably. So that is one way of thinking about it. The other possibility is that Congress in Washington delays it. Nicole Maliotakis ran and won, and one of her proposals was don't allow federal infrastructure funding unless there is an amendment to the appropriations that say we're going to delay or cancel congestion pricing with the Republicans potentially in control of the House and a very close Senate. That's something that could conceivably pass. And of course, when and if that happens, it will be the Republicans who are blamed. But this is why this law was passed in 2019. The delays that the Biden administration and the Hochul administrations affected after Trump was gone will certainly matter a lot, because it's those delays that have created the space for political changes at the federal and the state level. History could repeat itself, and Congress ended congestion pricing in 1977, could easily do it again.
Are there any accommodations for people who live in the zone? Is there any discussion about that?
Fewer than 20% of Manhattan households own a vehicle. People who live in the zone, pardon me? So yes, so it's going to be fantastic for residents of Manhattan. Is that the question? Because 80% of them rely exclusively on public transport, and they will have improvements to public transportation. The 20% who own cars will have an easier, quicker, more reliable drive. If you use your car daily, then that's a choice that you get to make. This is about expanding choices. There is an exemption, yes, there's an exception for Manhattan householders who use cars who earn under $60,000 a year will not be subject to the congestion charge.
I want you to know after this we have one more question. I hope our panelists can stay a few minutes after this. I mean, we usually don't even go this long, but this is so fascinating. if you could stay a few minutes after our final question.
Can I ask a question? Is this the most effective way to raise money to improve our transportation system? It seems that it has been saddled with a lot of punitive things going on, either unrealized or untested, and yet we need the money for our transit system. And it's almost as if we get the feeling that our public officials are hiding behind this and not using a better way of finding the money and financing transit or housing or any of the other issues presented to us. And here we are bickering over this particular system.
I don't have a great answer except to say that, you know, the MTA really wanted that $1 billion a year that it would use to generate $15 billion for this capital plan. But it is doing a lot of work as we see. And I think I've asked them or someone else has asked them, you know, what if it doesn't happen? What are you going to do? You know, they will continue with the work they're doing, just not maybe at the same speed or with not as quickly. But you know, I think the work will still get done. It just won't be as quick or as fast, and maybe you know it won't be improved as quick as you would want. It'll take 2 decades as opposed to maybe 1 decade.
Is there any possibility of Byford coming back? Because he seemed to have some very interesting
Love Andy.
things to do, and it was stopped because of personalities.
And Boston has come to us.
Just to let you know, we actually had him speak to us in the short term he was here. He was wonderful. We were really sad to see him go.
I'd like to actually address the prior question also. I'm not sure that it's punitive. The question of how to fund transportation has been very dynamic. Historically, transportation was funded by property taxes because, in fact, it makes sense that because your property value is highly contingent on the accessibility, right? So my very same bricks and mortar that I have, and I live in Brooklyn, New York, if you just moved that same building to almost anywhere else in the United States, let's keep San Francisco and Washington, D.C. out of there, but it would be worth about $2 million less than it is worth, right? So, and why is it worth that much? Because of the transportation infrastructure that allows me to access Manhattan. So historically, all this transportation infrastructure was paid for by property taxes. Again, I'll say the reason that Long Island Railroad, Metro North, all these systems were successful was not because they were ever successful as transportation systems when they were built, but because the land speculation was extremely lucrative, and so those builders got their profits on the land value, not on the transit system. In the Depression, land value went to zero, and so property taxes went to zero, and then we started talking about user fees, and that's when we started introducing gas taxes and things like that. Well, the federal gas tax has not been increased since 1991. So I ask you, what other forms of finance are there, right? So I think this is actually elegant, right? We have a horrific congestion in the congestion zone, and we have a desperate need to improve our transit system. And without transit, there really is no New York, okay? And so this, I think, kills both birds with one stone, although it does not solve the array of problems that it's wonderful to see the understanding in this room of all of these different issues, but it does contribute to solutions to the problems that will continue to change. These problems won't be solved once and for all. So sorry about the mic. Sorry about the speech.
Thank you all. We can't go on anymore. This has been awesome. I'm going to use your term, Rachel. It's been elegant. And we really should have a part 2. This was really, seems to be an ongoing conversation. If you could stay a few minutes, I know, first of all, we'd like to get a couple of photos, and I'm sure that there are still more people who have questions for you. But thank you once again. This has been terrific.
Thank you.